Connecticut junior Selena Soule was edged out of the top 6 spots, in part by 2 transgender runners.
A professor at Shawnee State University in Ohio is suing the school after being punished for refusing to use a student's preferred gender pronouns.
Transgender rights are human rights.
And now, please welcome our panel and our moderator, Family Research Council's Director of Partnerships and Coalitions, Sarah Perry.
Good morning. Well, that was not an easy video to watch, particularly for those of you who have kids, because we are, as Gil said, living in a very different age. But if we do not say the hard things, and we do not say them quickly, they will get harder. So we're going to talk about the issue of transgenderism and separate some fact from fiction. 20 years ago, none of us would have believed that the word sex in federal legislation would have been open to interpretation. We couldn't have imagined that the New York City Human Rights Commission would have identified 31 distinct genders worthy of legal protection. We might not have thought that a teacher in Virginia would have been fired for refusing to use nonsensical pronouns for a trans-identifying student, and we never would have believed that a mother in New Jersey would have been powerless to stop a university clinic from prescribing and securing life-altering treatments for her teenager suddenly identifying as transgender. That we even need today's discussion is a symptom of the increasing sexualization and medicalization of this nation's kids, desperate to create identities free of constraints and address their own internal brokenness. Children and adults are willing to eschew science in light of fantasy while ignoring their underlying psychological, neurological, or developmental conditions. Just this year, the CDC reported that a full 2% of all high school kids now identify as trans. My 3 guests understand this rapid expansion of the transgender contagion full well, and I am so excited to introduce them to you. I'll give you a little introduction, and then I'm going to let them tell their stories before we have a conversation. Lynn Meager is an advocate for parents of kids with rapid onset gender dysphoria. She is a member of the bipartisan Hands Across the Aisle Coalition, which is dedicated to protecting the legal rights of women and girls. She was profiled by the Christian Post a few months ago with a story entitled, "I've lost 2 kids to the trans cult and I want them back." She is fighting drag queen story hours at public libraries across the coast, and she has helped start the Ask Moms group on Facebook to educate and inform everyday parents in how to fight the gender identity onslaught. Dr. Andre Von Mol is a board-certified family physician in private practice, and he serves on the board of Bethel Church of Reading and is the co-chair of the American College of Pediatricians Committee on Adolescent Sexuality. He is a former naval officer and a media spokesperson for the Christian Medical and Dental Association. He works with Alliance Defending Freedom and advises the Global Medical Research Institute. He also teaches a course on bioethics for the Bethel School of Ministry. And Kathgrace Duncan was born female but lived for 11 years as a male. 27 years ago, she came out of that lifestyle, and her story is one of freedom and redemption through her relationship with Jesus Christ. She is currently, yes, we praise God for her. I cannot wait to have her tell her story. She is a women's ministry leader at the Portland Fellowship, where she co-leads a small group and mentors and teaches with the Taking Back Ground program. She is also the chairwoman of the Portland Fellowship Board of Directors. So ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome again our 3 special guests. So let's hear their stories, and we're going to start with Lynn. Lynn.
Good morning. I had a dream. maybe you can identify. I held my babies. I read to them. I fed them healthy food most of the time. I invested in their education. I cheered them on, I prayed for them, I worried about them. And I loved them with all my heart. I dreamed that they would one day grow up to be happy, healthy, and successful people who reached their potential and impacted the world for good. I now call that my antebellum life. I never dreamed that 2 of my 3 children would grow up to experience mutilating surgery and cross-sex hormone treatments. I never dreamed that I would be villainized and shut out of their lives for being concerned and skeptical that my daughter, who grew up riding horses, playing with dolls, wearing dresses, loving makeup, having sleepovers, would change her name, undergo a double mastectomy, and take testosterone in high doses, which will likely result in her needing a hysterectomy before she is 30. I never dreamed that 2 of my 3 children would be sterilized, and I never realized until I lived this nightmare that there are thousands of fractured families and broken dreams and parents whose dreams are shattered. We have nowhere to go for support. If we ask for help, this is what we are told. You should be proud of your son for finding his true self. Wouldn't you rather have a live son than a dead daughter? I'm sure if you work a little harder, you can use those correct pronouns. Don't ever call him that name again. That's his dead name. You're traumatizing him. After my story was published in the Christian Post, I began hearing from parents all over the world. The stories are remarkably similar and devastating. Loving, caring parents are watching helplessly as their children's lives are suddenly and dramatically transformed from dreams to nightmares. There is nowhere to turn, as teachers and doctors and therapists have a one-size-fits-all agenda for any young person who declares that they want to be a different gender. No questions are allowed. It is full steam ahead to the gender clinic for hormones, a breast binder, surgery, and a new name and identity. And I'm going to tell you that not one of these parents have told me about their child who is happy and suddenly thriving into a new and confident self. These kids are struggling, just like mine. Their lives become all about being trans. College and career and life plans are put on hold, sometimes indefinitely. And these kids are incredibly fragile. They don't know who they are anymore. Every word, every expression, every action of their parents and everyone else around them is interpreted and examined as their identity somehow depends on the acceptance and affirmation of the world around them. And everyone is required to say and believe only things that affirm their new gender. Any other issues they are experiencing are swept under the carpet. Most of them are suffering from anxiety, depression, social struggles, body anxiety, and a lot of them are on the autism spectrum. But parents' concerns about these significant issues are routinely dismissed. And we're hearing more and more stories of desisters. Young people have gone through transition, and after a few years, they've come to deeply regret these decisions. And these young people would carry the scars of the gender industry for the rest of their lives. They are young women with broken voices, permanent body and facial hair, male pattern baldness, scarred and flat chests, sterility, atrophy and permanent damage of their reproductive organs, their arms forever damaged, scarred, and weakened from radial phalloplasty surgery. Look it up, it's sad. Mutilated genitalia, loss of sexual function, increased risk of heart disease, bone loss, and overwhelming psychological trauma. Their existence is minimized because their stories are inconvenient to an industry committed to helping young people fight their own bodies. How do the doctors and the therapists and the teachers know which kids are going to grow up to deeply regret these treatments and to realize that there was nothing wrong with their healthy bodies to start with. I'm going to ask you, how many mutilated kids is too many? And how are we tolerating this? As parents, we are terrified, we're alone, we're unsupported, we are blamed. We're grieving, and we're lost. There are untold numbers of us, thousands. We can't even find each other. We are silenced, afraid to speak up, to protest, to stand for truth and health and wholeness for our own children. If we do, often our children will leave us, claiming that we are hateful, bigoted, fascist Nazis. They will be supported in this view by the online community, the courts, healthcare workers, Planned Parenthood, and the culture at large, as the majority is not supporting actual truth. We are caught in an unbelievably difficult and untenable place. We are silenced, and we are devastated. The time is now to demand that rigorous scientific research is done to examine the safety and efficacy of medical transition for children. It's time to require accountability. It's time to listen to the parents and to the young people who have been scarred and broken. I beseech you, we need to demand better for our kids and our families. I'm frightened, and you should be too. Thank you.
What a heartbreaking story. Dr. Van Mol, give us some sense of the science behind this movement.
Well, I've been given 4 questions to answer for you in 10 minutes, which on the bright side, that's 4 times more time than the California legislature has ever given me testifying against these bills. But the 3 of us could fill the rest of the day with information on different aspects of this and still have stuff to say, but away we go. Brain development. That prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe of the brain, doesn't fully develop until someone's 23 or 25 years of age, and that's the brain's judgment and inhibition center. The amygdala is the primary emotional center, and that's not mature in a teenager either, nor is its connection to that frontal lobe fully developed. That means kids think, but they tend to think emotionally. Now, children have developing brains. Their minds change often. They can't project out to long-term consequences. This has implication. This has risk. The Swedish Pediatric Society, interestingly enough, just this year, said that giving children this unfettered right to make life-altering changes when they don't have the mental capacity to project what it means is, and I quote, not scientifically founded and contrary to medical practice. Now, what are children experiencing? A little terminology here. Gender is an engineered term. It is linguistics leveraged against biology. Nouns have gender, people have asex. Now, gender itself as it's used is subjective, fluid, and self-declared. Gender identity, it's a feeling. It's a self-perception, usually a sex stereotype. Interesting, coming from groups that supposedly so hate stereotypes. Gender dysphoria and transgenderism are not the same. Gender dysphoria is a diagnosis, great discomfort with your biological sex. That's gender dysphoria. Transgenderism is an overarching ideological term, okay? Moving right along here. Prevalence. According to the DSM-5 of the American Psychiatric Association, the prevalence in males of gender dysphoria is somewhere between 0.005% and 0.014%. For females, between 0.002 and 0.003. Infinitesimal. And yet now we're told 2% of America's youth identify as maybe I'm trans. Something changed, and it can't have been biology or genetics. Desistance, that's the norm for gender dysphoria. Desistance means it tends to go away on its own. Usually by adolescence, most often by adulthood. What percentage are we talking about? A very strong case can be made from a broad spectrum of the medical literature across the Western world that it's 85% and up. this should have consequences in terms of our thinking. Mental health, I could spend an hour talking about this. An overwhelming percentage of people with gender dysphoria have underlying mental health issues and or neurodevelopmental problems, by which I mean autism spectrum disorder primarily. They also have a large amount of personality disorders, and quite often that's narcissism. And I'm not meaning they just have one or the other. You can have a whole pool of these things. Why autism spectrum? Because autistic kids tend to think concretely. They tend to latch on to ideas, and then they're coached into the idea that, I know why I'm different now, I'm trans. And then how do you get that idea out of their head? Until it's way too late. Autogynephilia, common in adult males, is a subgroup of the transgender ideology, gender dysphoria, and that's the tendency of men to be sexually aroused by the thought or image of themselves as a woman, and then the rest takes it up from there. Now, what about rapid onset gender dysphoria? That's the sudden presentation of gender dysphoria in the pubescent or post-pubescent kids who didn't show any sign of it before whatsoever. Dr. Lisa Littman of Brown University in 2018 did a landmark study on this, surveying parents of kids with rapid onset gender dysphoria. And they found certain hallmarks amongst them. One or more of their friends became gender dysphoric or trans-identified recently. We're seeing now, you've perhaps, read about this in the papers or heard on the news, of like cheerleading squads in high school where 3 or 4 of the cheerleaders come out as trans together. Well, statistically, that's impossible. Why is that happening? The parents found that their kids had increasing use of social media and the web before the declaration, worsening of the child's mental health the further this went on, worsening isolation from family and from any non-trans identified friends, and a strong distrust of any information that came from non-trans affirming sites. Now, it's a social contagion is the way this thing is spreading now. I know there are some who deny it, but it's self-evident. Puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and their long-term side effects. Now keep in mind, we're talking immature developing brains being imposed upon by ideology, and then hormones hits that, and it's a bad mix. The international standard of care for gender dysphoria is watchful waiting. Now that implies a psychological evaluation extensively of the child and the family. It doesn't mean doing nothing like one legislator argued against me. What we're seeing now, the UK's Tavistock Centre, which is the only gender identity clinic in the NIH, is coming under strong criticism from many quarters now to explain what exactly is going on, because things don't look right. The Swedish Pediatric Society just this year joined together with the Swedish National Council for Medical Ethics, as well as separately, the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, that are either directly calling for or have already instituted a national top-to-bottom reevaluation of what is going on with this gender-affirming therapy with kids. It's not looking right, and it shouldn't. Why is providing skilled psychological intervention, which is again the international standard of care, being shamed as transphobic? There's underlying causes. There always are. They tend to be multiple. They don't go away with gender affirmation therapy, and they must be dealt with. Those will be the seeds of regret. When you've done something to your body, you can't take back. What's gone is gone, and then you realize your problems are still there. And that's when the suicide risk really skyrockets. I said in an interview recently, since the American mental health establishment has largely given up on their jobs of investigating underlying factors, contributory factors, what we're left with is the cult of affirmation, and it very much operates like one. Now, puberty blocking agents, not as reversible as we've been led to believe. If you go with the Endocrine Society guidelines of puberty blocking at Tanner stage 2, that's before puberty is hit. Menarche doesn't happen. Spermarche doesn't happen. Spermanova won't develop. Continuing on from there to cross-sex hormones means the child's external genitalia will remain stunted. That means you have a little girl who's got a menopausal genitalia. You've got a boy who is highly likely not to be able to experience orgasm or ejaculation. That's a problem. And fewer than 5% of the kids entering this gender-affirming therapy don't even attempt fertility preservation. And by the way, if you're getting puberty blocked at Tanner stage 2, there's nothing to preserve. It hasn't developed yet. Interestingly, on the subject of cross-sex hormones, just this past week, The Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Medicine, which is the big endocrinology journal in America, reported this big international panel that concluded that the only evidence-based indication for testosterone therapy for women is for treatment of what's called hypoactive sexual desire disorder. They went on to say there's insufficient data to support the use of testosterone for the treatment of any other symptom or clinical condition. And they conveniently made no mention of gender affirmation therapy. It's like the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. Potential harms, you've already heard some of them, but why are there potential harms? Because I've heard some of these studies, you might say, that say, well, all we're doing is taking what was a biological female and giving her male levels of testosterone, which with she identifies and vice versa. Let's translate that. You're taking a biological female body and administering 20 to 40 times the amount of testosterone that body would ever see outside of an endocrine tumor, vice versa for men. That means you're maxing out on the possibility of complications, and they involve compromised fertility and sexual dysfunction, dyslipidemias, which means high cholesterol and what comes with that, thromboembolic disease, blood clots, cardiovascular and cerebrovascular disease, so we're talking strokes and heart attacks, osteoporosis, and various cancers. The bone mineral density thing you've heard referred to a few times, those pubertal years are when the bones experience their greatest increase of density in your life, but not on puberty blockers. So what does that mean? Is a kid in their 30s and their 40s going to have osteoporosis? Could well be, but we don't know. We can't tell them they won't, right? The myth of buying time. Puberty blockers are sold as a pause button, a wait and see. They're not. It commits a child to a route of action. You are changing, you are intervening, you are converting, for those who hate that word, what likely would have been desistance, and you're committing it now to persistence and all the problems that come with it. The myth of suicide reduction. Lynn just told us that classic line that parents are being bullied with, do you want a live son or a dead daughter? Well, what kind of intimidation is that? Especially a parent who's an extremist with the situation, right? Bailey and Blanchard, two very famous psychology professors in the world of, let's say, alternate sexuality, they said, there is no persuasive evidence that gender transition reduces gender dysphoric children's likelihood of killing themselves. And the idea that mental health problems, including suicidality, are caused by gender dysphoria rather than the other way around is currently popular, politically correct, and unproven. Stigma, we hear that all the time too. 2016 study examined 40 years of data in children referred for gender dysphoria, and they said that once they controlled for general behavior problems, stigma was not a significant predictor of suicide or suicidality. Ethical considerations, my fourth and final point. Well, what are the self-evident ethics of medicalizing forever something that had an 85% rate of desistance and doing it based on a self-diagnosis? The ethics of permanently medicalizing someone like that obviously is highly suspect. There is no lab, there is no imaging study, there's no test that I or any other physician can do to a gender dysphoric kid, or excuse me, to a kid in general, to know who will be the so-called true trans and who will desist. How can a child consent to that? How can an adolescent? How can a parent? They can't. There's a paper by a psychologist, Levine, going over the details of consent, and he points out pretty clearly the holes in this program. And when anybody undergoes so-called gender affirmation therapy, they're a patient for the rest of their life. They will always need those hormones, and then they will likely need treatment for the complications. Whatever amount of surgery they engage, they'll be fighting their body's attempt to repair itself for the rest of their life. They're a patient forever, to the profit of people who shouldn't be making profit off of this kind of thing. This mirrors the tragedy of the lobotomy movement of the 50s and 60s that also had psychological organizations pushing it, saying, okay, this is modern, this is science, the way it should be. And for that matter, the 1920s eugenics forced sterilization movement. And my state of California was eyebrow deep in both of them, and we shouldn't be involved in this. Thank you.
It's hard to argue with that depth of science and research, isn't it? Kathgrace, share with us your incredible story.
So now let me tell you what God can do. So I was born a girl, And before I went to kindergarten, at the ages of 3 and 4, I would ride my tricycle over to pick up my girlfriend because I believed I should have been born a boy. Before I went to kindergarten, I already had the idea that I should have been born a boy. I grew up continuing with that idea that I was born into the wrong body. And at the age of 12, between the ages of 10 and 12, I was also sexually molested by a family member. Looking back, the Lord has shown me that what I believed back then is, I watched my dad, who was verbally and emotionally abusive to my mom, and I watched my mom crumble underneath that abuse. And so that lie was presented to me as women are weak, women are vulnerable, and women are hated. And I looked at my mom and I realized, oh, I'm going to grow up to be that. I don't want to be that. I'm going to be a man. But I don't want to be the man that my dad is, so I will be the man that my dad is not, and I will rescue women. That was my belief system. Did I know that then? No. But that's, I didn't have the tools to filter to see that my dad was abusive. He was narcissistic. So as I continued to grow with that, at 7 years old, my little brother was born, and he was adored. And that also told me that me as a woman can be replaced. In order to have that affirmation, I needed to be a man. So I bought the lie, hook, line, and sinker. At the age of 16, I got a car and I began to live a double life. I was dating girls and telling my parents I was going to hang out with friends. At the age of 19, it grew so much so that I had to go live as a man. And so I moved out of the house and I began hormones. And I changed my name over. 2 weeks later, I moved in with a family, and she had 2 daughters that were 14 and 12. They invited me to their youth group, so I went. After I changed my name, I got saved. However, because the Lord didn't strike me dead, now I accepted the Lord 3 times because I wanted to be sure it was going to work, that it was going to stick. And because the Lord didn't strike me dead or say that I had to go back or anything that I was doing was wrong, I thought he was okay with it. So I continued to live as a man. I had lost my job thanks to my dad. He went into my employer and said, "This is not a man who's working for you, this is my daughter." And I immediately got fired. So I got another job, and at this job I met a Christian woman, and we began to date. And she showed me as a Christian I should be reading my Bible. So I began to read my Bible, not understanding really a word that was being said in there. And after dating for quite a while, we broke up, and we had both been involved in this church, and she decided to go find a different church, and I stayed. Well, right after the breakup, I jumped into another relationship. That whole, what do you call that when you jump? Rebound, thank you. So I rebounded into this relationship, and a year later, after dating this woman, I woke up and I was like, oh my gosh, she's my mom and I'm my dad. And I thought, I can't do this. I don't want to be him, and I don't want her to be my mom. So I broke up with her. Upon breaking up, I got more involved in the church because I had more time now. And one night, I had joined the orchestra practice, and one night on my way to the orchestra practice, the Lord said to me, "Will you now? Will you now?" And so I took this inventory of my life, and I thought, I have nothing to lose right now. I have nothing to stop me. And I said, "Yes, Lord, I will." 3 months later, okay, so I'm a little slow on the process here. I was addicted, heavily addicted to pornography. During that year relationship of the abusive one with the woman, I had went to pornography for comfort. And when I said, "Yes, I will" to the Lord, he delivered me that night from pornography, and I am still free.
Amen. Amen.
So I continued to dive into the church. I was fascinated by the Lord. I wanted to know him. I wanted to know more of him. And the Lord brought to me some spiritual parents, and he began to work on my dad issues, though I didn't understand what was going on. All I knew is this guy was making me cry a lot by just loving on me. And the more I got involved in church, they began to see, hey, this guy's leadership material. So next thing I know, I'm leading a men's Bible study. I have a junior high boys small group. I'm in leadership at the singles, and then I'm also part of the adults. And then, I was just known everywhere. And it came about that through a bunch of circumstances that they had found out that let me back up. I had told my spiritual parents about where I was, that I was actually once a woman and blah, blah, blah. And when I first got saved, at the job I was at, a woman I worked with also went to church with me, and she told the pastors, oh, I heard this about Keith. That was my name. And so they called me in, and I told them that I was a man who used to be a woman. And when they heard that, they said, we love you, but you can't come back here. So that was the church I was saved at. So I got confronted at this church that I'm now I was attending, and I was asked the very same question. We're hearing some rumors about you, and we just want to know, who are you? Who are you really? And so I said to them, and I told the truth this time. I said, I'm a woman living as a man. And when I did, the Holy Spirit went and blew into me. And I saw the next 2 weeks and everything that I had to do, and I had to go back to being the woman that He created me to be. So as I sat there in front of the pastor, having all this knowledge of what the Lord just showed me, I said to him, so what do you think I should do? He's like, well, you should, how about you, I don't know. And I said, well, let me share with you what the Lord showed me. And he's like, okay. So I said, well, first I need to go back to being the woman that God created me to be. And then I need to step down from this ministry, and I need to step down from this ministry, and I need to step down from this ministry, and I need to go break up with my girlfriend. I had another girlfriend at the time. And he's like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna walk with you through this. I'm gonna go this next 2 weeks with you, and we're gonna take care of this. I said, great. So he did. He did exactly what he said he was gonna do. I came out in February of 1993, and then August of the same year, I started investigating the Portland Fellowship. And they had a program at that time where we just got together. The Taking Back Ground program had not yet been developed. And so I met with a bunch of women. When they say it takes a village to raise a child, it took a village to raise me again. And so I started working on who I was. And I have to say that I don't think what they realize is that being transgender is not the issue. Sex is not the issue. It's a relational issue. And it's that brokenness that, those things that we weren't fed when we were little. I wasn't nurtured. I wasn't told I was loved ever. I don't remember ever being told that I was loved, that I was pretty, that none of that was affirmed. So as they continued to work on all of this, it took 5.5 years before I crossed back over into living as a woman. And in doing so, the Lord began to move quickly. And I became a small group leader at the Portland Fellowship, helping those who are also struggling with just who they are. And it was helping them to understand who they are in Christ and how He created them to be. And then after being a small group leader for a while, I realized that at the Portland Fellowship, I was known by my testimony. So I stepped away from the Portland Fellowship because everybody would approach me, oh, weren't you the one that lived as a man? Yeah, great. So I stepped away for about 4 years, and I came back because I really wanted to figure out, apart from the Portland Fellowship, who was I as a woman? Who had God created me to be, and how do I function outside of the Portland Fellowship? So the 4 years passed, and I came back to the Portland Fellowship, and eventually I began to teach, and then became part of the board. And then again, the Lord said, I want you to become chair. So there I was, a chair. And then I stepped up into the position of being the women's ministry leader. And at one point, when I was preparing to teach at the Portland Fellowship on identity, I realized, I was looking through the material, and I realized how free I was. I was no longer attracted to women, didn't want that, didn't want to live as a man, oh my gosh. All these things, no offense, man. You have that part covered really well. I don't need to do that. But I realized all these things that I had become free from, and I asked the Lord about that. And I said, Lord, how did that happen? Because I vowed I would never go back to being a woman. Vowed that. I said, Lord, how did that happen? And he ponders my question. And then he says, I don't know. And I said, Lord, how can you not know? You were there. You walked with me. You called me out. How do you not know? And he said to me, I never saw you that way. I came to realize that the Lord only ever saw me through his daughter and the plans he had for me. And so I'm here today to tell you, I am not the man I used to be.
Let's give our panelists a round of applause. Wow. 3 incredible stories. So my hope was that we would have time for questions. Unfortunately, because I heard a rumor that somebody who's apparently a big deal is coming to dinner tonight, we are on a little bit of an accelerated schedule. So let me tell you this. If you're sitting there and you're wondering what to do, let me tell you this, keep speaking truth. And I promise you it will be uncomfortable. God doesn't tell us it's going to be easy. In fact, he promises us that in this life we will have trouble, that he will overcome. And also, be praying about ways that you can minister to other people's brokenness. Pray that the Holy Spirit reveals to you ways to reach out to people like these. And so in that way, you bring them into the fold of Christ's love. Let me tell you a couple of things that are no's in this story. Science is not fungible. Biology is not bigotry. Sex is not gender. But I'm going to leave you with a few yeses. God is bigger than pronouns.
Right?
God is bigger than anyone's brokenness. And God is bigger than any movement. We just have to wait for it. Thanks, everyone.